Welcome to Reaching Out. I'm Gregory Floyd, President Local 237 Teamsters. Today, our very special guest is Congressman Hakeem Jeffries from Brooklyn. He also has parts of Queens. Congressman, welcome to Reaching Out.
Greg, thank you very much for having me on.
Now, before we get into our conversation, a little bit about your family history and background. Back in the early 90s, there was a Professor Leonard Jeffries. I understand he's a relative of yours.
He's an uncle, my father's brother. My father and him grew up in Newark, actually. My father as a social worker. My uncle went into the academy. My mother actually is a caseworker, and my wife is a social worker, so I come from a family of social workers. Not sure what happened to me, although some of what we do as an elected official is deal with social work type issues on behalf of our constituents. In terms of the Newark connection, I also have a cousin who's currently running to fill the vacancy that had been created as a result of Cory Booker's departure to the Senate, Shavard Jeffries. I was just with him a few days ago and certainly look forward to him running a very vigorous, robust campaign.
What is that election?
That election is in May of next year.
May of next year. Then we have to have him on the show. We're very interested to hear what he has to say. Our listeners also, the station also reaches out to Jersey, so we'd like to have him come on.
Absolutely.
And just tell us his vision for Newark.
That would be phenomenal. Mayor Booker, or former Mayor Booker, has done some important things, but building upon what he's accomplished, I know Shavard Jeffries is hopeful of taking the city forward and taking it to the next level.
Very good. Now, this is your first term in the 8th Congressional District in Brooklyn. And of course, you have some communities in Queens. How are the people in your district doing?
Well, I represent a hardworking district of largely working families, moderate income folks, some areas of affluence and some areas of intense poverty. Overall, it's a tremendous district in terms of its diversity, racial, religious, ethnic diversity. It begins in the downtown Brooklyn area, includes parts of Boerum Hill, Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, parts of Prospect Heights, all of Bedford-Stuyvesant, parts of Crown Heights, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, East New York, Canarsie, Flatlands, parts of East Flatbush. And then we swing south across the southern border of Brooklyn, the neighborhoods of Mill Basin and Bergen Beach, Manhattan Beach, Brighton Beach, Coney Island, and Seagate. And I'm still not done, Greg. I still have a few neighborhoods in Queens that I represent as well, proudly, Lindenwood, Howard Beach, and Ozone Park. As many of your listeners may know, several of those neighborhoods were hard hit by Superstorm Sandy.
Yes, they were.
Canarsie, Coney Island, Brighton Beach, Howard Beach, Manhattan Beach. And so I've spent the better part of this year in those areas working as hard as I can to help with the rebuilding and the recovery effort. We've come a long way. FEMA money has flowed into many parts of the district. The federal Superstorm Sandy aid package, which we passed in January, was the first meaningful piece of legislation that I worked on and my first opportunity to speak on the floor of the House of Representatives. But now we want to make sure that we can get the resources that the federal government has authorized into the homes, into the businesses, and to the public housing developments, many of which were hit hard in the Coney Island community that I represent, as you well know,
yes,
but also in Red Hook and in Far Rockaway.
Well, tell me, a year after the storm, how do we see the district recovering? What has been done so far? I know there's still a lot of work to be done, but what can we say is tangible that we could point to and say this was actually done by using federal dollars?
Well, it's a great question. Many of the people who were displaced from the homes in areas like Seagate or Coney Island, Canarsie, or Howard Beach are back in their homes 1 year later. That's a tremendous step in the right direction. What we haven't been able to do is to fortify those homes in many instances in a meaningful way to better protect against the future of extreme weather events. That is a longer term project that's going to be important. Now, the city has been provided with a significant amount of money to better fortify and create a greater degree of resiliency in those homes and in our shoreline communities. Those efforts are a longer term initiative, but there's an urgency to it because each season that passes by brings us closer to another hurricane season as we move into 2014. And there's a significant amount of anxiety, as you might imagine, to get things accomplished. Canarsie, for instance, is surrounded by 3 bodies of water, Fresh Creek to the east, Pattagate Basin to the west, and Jamaica Bay on the southern boundary of Canarsie. The people there feel particularly vulnerable. All of the communities that I represent that are along the Atlantic Ocean, from Brighton Beach to Manhattan Beach, from Seagate to Coney Island, feel particularly vulnerable. And so the next level of conversation is, what can we do to better strengthen our shoreline protection in order to guard against the possibility of future extreme weather events?
It seems like hurricane season may be over, and we may have skated by this year's hurricane season. We were quite fortunate, and we're still trying to recover from last year's hurricane season. But a couple of years ago, I believe it was 2011, we had a hurricane that occurred. It wasn't as drastic as this one, because I think some people thought this hurricane, Hurricane Sandy, was going to be like the last one, and we weren't prepared for that.
That's a very good point. And one of the things that I found, the very next day after Superstorm Sandy hit our shores, I was in the communities of Coney Island and Seagate. And what I found was that the overwhelming majority of people did not leave. And the reason why they did not leave, despite the fact that the city had ordered a mandatory evacuation in those areas, is because there was a view based on the hurricane from 2011, Hurricane Irene, that this was a situation where the government was crying wolf, because there were significant projections of doom and gloom surrounding Hurricane Irene, a lot of noise that it would come in with a bang, when in actuality it arrived with a whimper. That was unfortunate in looking at what happened in 2012, because it created a situation where, when the warnings were issued connected to Superstorm Sandy, far too many people stood at home. Far too many people stood in many of the public housing developments in Red Hook, in Far Rockaway, and in the Coney Island neighborhoods that I represent. And as a result, it created a great deal of trauma afterward, when people were stuck in many of these buildings and homes, absent power, absent electricity, absent food and water in some instances in the immediate aftermath. So that's an important lesson, and I think we all can learn in terms of communicating the urgency of an evacuation, and also being better prepared in the aftermath for dealing with an extreme weather event. That's certainly something that NYCHA needs to learn.
Sure. And I also want to add that the projection of Hurricane Irene was probably correct. And for whatever reasons, the winds could shift in a different direction. Things could happen. It could happen overnight. It could happen hour by hour, minutes by minute. And people should not ignore the professionals, because, listen, nobody really knows what's going to happen. The forecast comes, and sometimes the winds go in a different direction. But we should always prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
That's absolutely correct.
And if we do that, we'll be okay. So I had to leave the house. It was a false alarm. Better safe than sorry, because one day it's not going to be a false alarm.
That's right. And we learned that with Superstorm Sandy.
From your years in the State Assembly, you've had to focus on housing issues, affordable housing. And for so many of us, it still remains the number one issue. What have you learned on the federal level as opposed to being in the state level about affordable housing?
Well, the federal government, to a large degree, has been out of the affordable housing business and divested from public housing in ways that have been harmful to the residents of the New York City Housing Authority and public housing residents all across the country. It's really a trend that began during the Reagan administration and unfortunately has continued moving forward since that time. President Clinton, President Obama certainly have a greater commitment to public housing residents than do some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But unfortunately, in the divided government context, what I've found is that many in the Tea Party have no interest generally in government working, and specifically don't see the need to invest in allowing for people of all different levels of socioeconomic position to receive the assistance that they need. Now, the affordable housing crisis is, in many instances, a uniquely urban problem that is particularly acute in New York City, in Boston, in San Francisco, and in a few other areas. And so what I found down in the Congress is that there's not a lot of sympathy from other parts of the country as to an issue that they cannot necessarily relate to. You know, the high cost of living in many ways is a particularly significant trait to us in New York. But we've got to fight to deal with it because we're in a city that is at risk of becoming a place simply for the wealthy and for the well-off. And that's totally unacceptable. Our diversity in this city is our greatest strength. And we've got to be a place where young people, where working families, moderate income folks, municipal employees, senior citizens can continue to live. This can't become simply an enclave for the rich and for the famous, for the wealthy and for the well-off. There's been some progress that has been made under Michael Bloomberg, but I think in many ways he did not recognize the pain that a lot of communities were under in terms of the intense gentrification that has been sweeping all across our city. That's something that at the city level, the state level, and the federal government level, we have to collectively work to prevent. With respect to NYCHA, we've got to deal with the sequestration problem. As a result of the first round of sequestration that kicked in on April 1st, NYCHA, I believe, lost approximately $190 million in operating support. That is already funding that we could not afford in terms of the public housing residents here in the city of New York, and it makes a bad problem worse. We're hopeful that as we approach the next round of sequestration, potentially kicking in on January 15th, we'll actually be in a position to reverse the prior cuts and restore some of the funding that has been lost for public housing and for Section 8 voucher assistance as well.
This is all the time we have for this segment of Reaching Out. I'm Gregory Floyd, President Local 237 Teamsters. A very special guest was Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Brooklyn. Thank you.
Thank you very much.